Hi friends, welcome to Mental Health Monday. I'm Heidi Gaiman from HeidiGaiman.com, and today we are going to talk about family dynamics. We're in our series about families, but we're especially going to talk about the concept and the topic of addiction. This is a loaded topic, and if this is something that has been a part of your life, whether in your family of origin or your life now in your family, whether those people living with you or those that are, apart from you, but still very much a part of your family and your extended family, know that this is a struggle. Addiction, it affects so many people. It is not a small number. If you want stats, you can Google that, so I won't take the time to give that to you. But know that stats don't matter when this is your struggle, right? Stats don't matter when this is your struggle. But also know that you are not alone, that there are a lot of resources out there that can help both the people struggling with addiction and those that love them. We're going to go through some of the ways that addiction impacts our family dynamics and maybe gather a little bit more understanding of addiction. Understand that this is not therapy, right? What we do on Mental Health Mondays is about education and about community support. So if you need help, I strongly encourage you to go find a local therapist. There's a couple of really good search engines online at Psychology Today or emdria.org. And if you need help with family therapy, there's also Gottman.com, which does couples and families, and you can find a certified therapist there. If you need some help, send me a DM. As far as finding someone and finding a good resource, if you have questions, always happy to help. But today we're going to cover three things. Number one, a little bit of basic information about addiction and the complication that is addiction. We're going to talk about some questions to ask yourself or to ask about the people that you love if you are wondering if someone is struggling with an addiction, because it's pretty gray sometimes, right? It's not always black and white. Then we're going to talk about the impact of the family relationships when people are struggling with addiction, or when there is also a mental health diagnosis as part of the puzzle, because that usually is true, and we'll get into that in just a second. And then the last thing we'll talk about is some barriers to seeking treatment, so we can maybe have a little bit more compassion for those struggling with addiction, and then also note whether those are happening in our own life if we're trying to help someone who is struggling with addiction. Number one, addiction never defines anyone. Just like anything else in our life, that's one piece of our puzzle. We have a lot more going on, right? There's a lot of awesome things about us. And I think in our society, we tend to label people as addict. And we want to take away that kind of language. We want to talk about someone's relationship with a substance or someone's relationship with some kind of addiction, rather than referring to the addiction in such an identity-focused way. What is someone's identity? Child of God, right? Person belonging to humanity, loved by the Most High God, died for by Jesus Christ, rose again for by Jesus Christ. Those kinds of things are what we want people to get as their identity, and so we have to change our language a little bit. So there is a difference between use, abuse, and addiction. Use, abuse, and addiction. And this is really important. So there is substance use, for instance, and that's what people, as soon as we say addiction, usually people think of substances. We'll talk about other kinds of addiction too. But use is when substances are part of our life, or when a certain habit or something is part of our life, a certain action that we do, a certain behavior is something that we participate in. And so there is a use to, using alcohol. There's a difference between consuming alcohol and using alcohol or drugs or other substances to numb, to take away the emotional struggle, to what we call it, like numb our pain. You can't selectively numb, is what Brene Brown says. We want to numb the dark things, numb the pain and struggle, but it also numbs the good stuff too. But that's for another episode. So we have to be cautious about, our use. What are we using it for? Is it a necessity in our life? Even maybe we only consume something once a month. Maybe we consume it even less. But what are we doing with it? What is its purpose in our lives is just as important as the person consuming it daily. that's an important thing about substances. Other Brene Brown, I was just reading in Daring Greatly in particular, which talks about this concept of numbing, but the use of things in our life for that. She also includes things like white sugar. Like I really like me some carbs or some ice cream. I'm dairy free now, so if we're struggling through something, right? Or chocolate. There's so many ways that we can take something and instead of turning and sitting with our emotions and sitting with hard stuff, we use something. Shopping can be the same way. People struggle with pornography, and people think there is a place often for using pornography but not having an addiction. And so you can see how it's a slippery slope. At the same time, there are things like alcohol that Scripture finds acceptable to use occasionally, and then pornography, which Scripture says no, it's not okay. So being aware of that, what is Scripture, what kinds of use are we doing that's like biblically okay, and maybe some of you watching, that's something that you have learned is not okay biblically. I encourage you to dive into that. Dive into it with a pastor, dive into it with a small group Bible study or something. Find out what God says is good in His Word, is okay in His Word, and what isn't. And then, find out for yourself those things. So moving on from use, then we also have abuse, where we start to use it more regularly. It becomes a part of our life where we need it to function. When we get to addiction, that's when it starts to do a lot of destructive things in our life. The DSM, which is our diagnostic manual for mental health, gives us a timeline for that. Someone has been using it and uses it X number of times, or participates in this thing X number of times, like gambling or some of those other addictions. That we find pretty clear cut in the DSM for diagnosis between abuse and then addiction. Addiction also assumes that your brain has been changed by it. So that's one, I think, a myth of it is that addiction is always a choice. And the reality is abuse and use, I think, have a lot more choice orientation to them, where addiction, your brain has been changed because of the use of these substances. It's a complicated scientific process about the way that our body releases chemicals and neurons and things to communicate, and this idea of reuptake and how it gets the information back and recycles or reuses that information that connects different parts of our brain and different concepts and understandings and our cravings and urges and things in our brain. And so know that addiction, there should be some judgment taken out of it because people are fighting a battle. There is a battle here. It is a real battle. Addiction does change our brain, and Satan uses that to just, I think, plummet on people and pummel them. And so we want to have some compassion in that, understanding that, wow, it is quite the battle to fight. And if you are a loved one of someone who struggles with addiction, you know the battle. You felt the weight of it. And our families around us, which is what this topic, this series is about, feel the weight of that. I think almost just as much because of the intimacy of families that God has designed, because of the intimacy of relationships that God has designed and put us in, we feel the weight of it so often just as much as a lot of the people experiencing addiction. So understand that that battle has also been yours, and we want to have compassion for those people that are fighting in that battle in their family and trying to help someone that they love. It's a long process often, but there is help. There's hope. There's always hope and hope. There's a lot of resources, and Jesus does, in fact, heal. His resurrection isn't just, for tomorrow, for heaven, for eternity. His resurrection is for those things in our life now. So some questions to ask yourself. There's a website I'm going to refer you to, and I'll put the link in the show notes. But I found some questions online at a website called drugrehab.com, and it has questions about different vocations and places in our life, and evaluating whether our substance use or our behavior that leans toward addiction, toward abuse, and more use is actually impacting us in a way that would be classified as addiction. That helps us just keep an eye on those things. If you come from a family that has a history of addiction, you want to be aware of unfortunately genetics, isn't it great when the genetics guns are fully loaded? And that is something you need to be a little bit more aware of maybe than some other people. If anybody is watching in our live episode and you have some addictions that come to mind that I haven't mentioned, please throw them up. If you have questions, throw them up. I can answer them either during the video or after the video in the comments and such. But go ahead and participate in any way. Always more fun that way, right? So let's talk about the family dynamics of addiction. Number one, there's usually a dual diagnosis. We call it a dual diagnosis. That means that there's a mental health diagnosis as well as the addiction itself, which is a mental health diagnosis. However, there's something else. Very rarely, and you can see this with the concept of numbing, do we get addicted to something because we went to a party and we had a drink and we're like, oh, suddenly I have a relationship with alcohol. There's parts of that are true, but at the same time, there's something else going on. Maybe it's social anxiety, like we have a drink, or I keep talking about drinking. My family has a relationship with addiction and alcohol in various parts of it, and so I think that might be why, and I apologize for overusing that example. But if we go to a party, we smoke marijuana, or if we get on our computer and we look at pornography accidentally, but then we look at it the next time because we feel disconnected and isolated from being loved or being valued. You can see some of the things that go into social anxiety or that go into anxiety or depression and isolation and things like that overlap with dual diagnosis. Sometimes we see it too with more severe and persistent things like bipolar in particular, or any kind of mood disorder. We see it with schizophrenia and really difficult diagnoses because people have delusions or hear voices, and those are deeply uncomfortable things. And so know that it's important to look for that dual diagnosis, look for a professional who sees past the addiction, that there is something else to treat here. And a lot of treatment facilities, you'll see the word dual diagnosis. That means they're going to treat more than the surface level of the addiction to get to other roots of the problem. There's a lot of times trauma or PTSD is associated with later addictions and things like that too. So then, addiction usually comes out in the teen years or in adulthood. Is it possible to see addiction in childhood? Yeah, we don't usually see that. You can see how what we call adverse childhood experiences and things that contribute to addiction, but we tend to see diagnoses later. I think that if you have concerns, go ahead and look at the questions, the website that I have for you for questions of someone's relationship or your own relationship with that substance. If you have a teen that you're concerned about, do not wait, because once they're 18, it's very difficult, and this is true for just mental health in general, it's very difficult to get the treatment that you want for them later because they're adults and they get to make their own decisions, and you can't make another person do things. And so, early and often, as in any treatment, is really helpful. That's an important fact in the family dynamics. You can't make people do things. You can't. And so know that they are separate people. They're self-differentiated, which we're going to talk about in the blog in a couple of weeks. But you can love them through it. Love, 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 love. And sometimes love looks really hard, doesn't it? It looks like truth more often than it looks like giving or doing. Okay, the opioid epidemic, I want to speak a little bit to that, which means prescription drugs is a huge problem in our culture in America here, and I don't know about other cultures, but in America we really struggle with that, and it is not a class-based problem. Lower, middle, upper class, doesn't matter your income level, opioids are a problem. And so if you have had a prescription drug, a narcotic in particular, a painkiller, you want to be aware of that. Stay in touch with your physician about how often you're taking that. Other ways to do pain management, again, it's so complicated. I can't tell you how complicated it is. So don't start judging other people's addictions or your own immediately, but kind of just be asking questions about how do we avoid, the overuse of opioids in our life and narcotics in our life. Again, with the numbing. It's just an easy way in our culture We have the pain scale at every hospital. The pain scale in very many places in our life, 0 to 10, how are you feeling? We need to reevaluate how we think of pain and its purpose in our body. But don't get me wrong, like pain is awful, and if you live in chronic pain, that is hard. And so there are a lot of treatment options for that, and a lot of ways that we can find some help, and even use narcotics in some way, but also have a healthy way to keep us from, leaning toward that addiction sliding slope. There is an upset in family dynamics. There's an upset in family dynamics when there's any kind of abuse, use, or addiction, and it does impact the family unit. Being honest about that is step one. Being honest about that with your spouse, if there's some kind of use, even that is bothering someone, being upfront about those things in kind and compassionate ways. That is always step one of any kind of mental health concern, is say the words and do it in kindness and compassion to ourselves and to the other people that we're interacting with. Family systems always want to move toward homeostasis. So if there's been addiction, they also, even though they want recovery and they want treatment and help and all this stuff, it's really hard and uncomfortable because family systems want it to feel like something they know. And so it's really difficult in families with addiction. Uncertainty usually becomes the norm, and so they will tend in recovery to move toward uncertainty in other ways. And we don't have time to get into that, but just be aware that recovery sometimes can feel just as uncomfortable as the addiction itself. And there are, that's what therapy's for. That's what 12-step programs and all of that good stuff for family members as well as the people experiencing it are for. And I really encourage people to engage in those things because it's a process. It's a process just like so much else in life. The last thing is barriers to treatment. This is a big one, this Addiction Mental Health Monday. Barriers to treatment include a lack of health insurance or a lack of health insurance coverage. If I had a thing that I could change in our world, besides bringing more compassion and kindness to it, it would be that we would stop calling things behavioral health care and we would just label it the same. So medical care is mental health care. Mental health care is medical care. Because there's a change in treatment, a change in what's available to you through your insurance company when we label it behavioral care. And so just know that you have to fight for what you need from your insurance a lot of the times, and you and your loved one need you to advocate for one another. That's part of the family battle together, is we're going to work through this, the confusion of health insurance. If you have an employee health insurance plan, don't be afraid to call them and ask questions and get what you need. That's important. And you can be aggressive, be aggressive in advocating for yourself and for those you love. Another thing is then finances, which is attached also to insurance, but finances in particular do dictate sometimes the quality of care you're going to get. Unfortunately, that's terrible. We need policies that change that. But again, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to fight for what you need, and ask for a sliding scale, we call it, which is, really great services maybe that might look really expensive at face value, but they offer something that's income-based for what you can provide. A few other ones, good treatment options are work to fight for, which we were just kind of talking about. And the energy to try to find them, we have to have compassion for the amount of energy that people dealing with addiction and people in their family are dealing with. So in our churches in particular, in our communities, we can offer some extra care for those that are in treatment for addiction, that are in treatment for dual diagnosis with mental health and all of that good stuff, the same way we would physical health problems. So bring them food, give a card, send encouragement, go visit in treatment facilities. I cannot tell you that enough. Go visit people at their home and encourage them. It's okay to design some things in life around the people that you love. And so that might mean that you have less alcohol in your house if you have someone who's dealing with a drinking problem. That might mean that you get rid of computers in your home because someone that you love in that home is struggling with pornography, and we just go use them at the library. Is that insanely inconvenient? Yes, it is insanely inconvenient. course, there's other barriers and blockades we can put on our computers and things like that to help. Accountability factors that we can put into place. So sometimes we don't have to go to the real extreme, but being willing to fight and have that energy to fight is a good thing, and we need to do it together. The last couple things is people live with fear of employment issues. They're scared they're going to lose their jobs. Is leave available for people if they are seeking treatment? You know, a lot of times the best advice I can give you is be upfront with employers and just tell them the struggle in a real way, but have yourself prepared for how you're going to tackle it and what it will look like. You know, what's the long game for the employer as well? Just like in any relationship, that employer needs to know that you are taking care of yourself in order to do your job. And so you have to work a little bit at communicating, I would say. That said, there is discrimination against things like addiction and how that impacts our employment places. I can't talk anymore. It's too long of a mental health Monday. But, you know, dive in and find out what your rights are. That's a good thing, you know, that's a good thing to Google, to talk to someone local to you who's a lawyer or who deals directly. Usually there's legal aid and things in social services. And just ask what your rights are maybe before you walk into that situation. Just some good tips there. The last thing is lifting the shame and fear of addiction and mental health. Just like all other parts of mental health, addiction has a huge element of stigma related to it. And hopefully some of this information we gave today will lift a little bit of that for some of you. But there is no shame in having a problem. We all have problems. Your problem looks different than the person sitting next to you. Your family member's problem looks different than those sitting next to you. But know that there is no shame in this problem because we all have them. We all have stuff in our lives. We all have stuff in our families. And there is help and there is hope for every single one of those problems. Satan is working hard. He's working overtime. He wants to push us down, but the reality is that Jesus Christ is always, pulling us up out of the pit. And the last thing I want to tell you is, for people who have addiction in their families, God works in the pit. He does. I have seen it time and time again. Sometimes that pit is so ugly, I can't even, right? It's painful and it's hard, but God does work. He does pull out of the pit and turn to the Psalms, turn to that language to know that Christ reaches in when we are suffering, when we have struggle, that he reaches in and pulls us out. And just keep praying. Pray, and pray some more because God is listening. Pray your angry prayers, pray your sad prayers, pray your joyful prayers. And just know that he hears. He hears. If you need anything, you can always find me at HeidiGaiman.com on the About page. There's a way to contact me. I'd love to hear your comments on Facebook and then in the YouTube archives as well. And if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me those questions in the comments or via a direct message and just give me a little time because sometimes I don't always get to it right away with my own family dynamics. So thanks for joining me. I am praying for you, friends, praying for all of you who join us for these Mental Health Mondays. And next week we'll cover mental health and marriage, its impact in marriage. I'll see you next time.